Section 6 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. John Inglesant, A Romance by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 3, Part 2. It was a fine summer morning when he made the visit. He had a horse of his own now, and a servant if he chose, but he preferred today to go alone. He found Mr. had discontinued his school and was entirely buried in his books, only reading morning and evening prayers, and a homily or one of his old sermons in the church on Sundays. He never left his study on other days except for a turn in his little garden. His house was by the wayside, with a small paved court before the hall, and by the side of this court the garden, into which the window of the study in a gabled wing adjoining the hall looked towards the road. He was pleased to see Inglesant, though he very dimly remembered him and questioned him of his studies. Johnny read him some Plato with the Jesuit's comments, of which the old gentleman took notes eagerly, and afterwards incorporated them in his book. The book he was writing was upon talismanic figures, but he was not particular what he put into it, anything of an occult and romantic character being welcome, and introduced with not a little ingenuity. He had no sense nor understanding of anything else in the world but such subjects in his books, and being exceedingly infirm, he could scarcely lift some of the larger folios which lay heaped about him within reach. He blessed God that his eyesight was so good, and that he could still read Greek, the contracted Greek type of that day. After some conversation, Inglesant opened his mind to him, told him what he had been reading, and asked his opinion. The old scholar pricked up his ears and set to work with great delight, taking notes all the time, and Johnny found, years afterward, when he happened to read his book in London, that all he told him was introduced into it. "I find nothing, my dear pupil," he said, "in the Christian Church very old concerning this doctrine, for that author who goes by the name of Dionysius the Areopagite is of far later date, but I will discover to you some mysteries concerning it, which, so far as I know, have never been brought to the light by any man. I found the germ of this doctrine in those fragments of metaphysics which go under Theophrastus, his name, who was a disciple of Aristotle, and succeeded him in his school, and was an excellent philosopher certainly, by the works by him which remain to this day. Here he says that the understanding joined to the body can do nothing without the senses, which help it as far as they can to distinguish sensible things from their first causes, but that all knowledge and contemplation of the first causes must be by very touching and feeling of the mind and soul, which knowledge thus gained is not liable to error. Synesius, a man well known amongst scholars, being vexed that this new divinity began in his day to be in request amongst Christians, and some illiterate monks and others taking advantage of it to magnify ignorance, to bring themselves into repute, Dionysius, I say, wrote that exquisite treatise which he inscribed Dio to prove the necessity of human learning and philosophy to all who will contemplate high things with sobriety and good success. God forbid, he says, that we should think that if God dwell in us, he should dwell in any other part of us than which is rational, which is his own proper temple. Now whether the writings of some ancient and later Platonists, Greeks and Arabs, heathens and Mahometans, be a sufficient ground and warrant for them that profess to ascribe more to the Scriptures, by which sobriety of sense is so much commended unto us, that in the opinion of heathen philosophers I leave you to consider. Then Inglesant left him, for he seemed more desirous to put ideas into his book than to impart them, and rode home across the downs. As he went, he overtook a gentleman riding an easy-going palfrey, whom he had found to be one whom he knew, one indeed of those who had attended the early morning mass in the chapel. This gentleman, who was one of those called church papists, that is, papists who save themselves from the charge of recusancy by sometimes attending their parish church, knowing Johnny and placing faith in him, began at once to relate his troubles. He dwelt sadly on the fines he had to pay and his difficulties in avoiding the communion at Easter, but his greatest troubles were caused by his wife, who was much more zealous than he was and refused to go to church once a month to keep off the churchwardens. Her religion, indeed, was so costly to him that he had rather have had a city lady with her extravagant dress. He was very particular in inquiring after Father St. Clare, and whether Inglesant knew of anything he was engaged in, but John could only give him no information, not knowing anything of the Jesuits' plans. They were hard times, he said, for a good quiet subject who wished to live at peace with his king and with his clergyman. But what with the fear of the apparator on one hand, and of his wife and her advisers among the Catholics on the other, he had a hard time of it. He was a cheerful man naturally, however, and leaving this discourse, which he thought would tire his companion, He entertained him for some time with the news of the country, of which he gathered great abundance in his rides. Among other things, he told him of a clergyman at a parish not far off, who, he said, must be a Catholic in his heart, for his piety was so great, and his punctuality in reading common prayer morning and evening in the church alone, and his surplice so regular, that, so common report ran, he had brought down an angel from heaven, who appeared to him in the church one evening in the glow of the setting sun, and told him many wonderful and heavenly things. When the gentleman had related this, they came to a point where their roads parted, and he invited Johnny, for he was very courteous, to come on to his house and sup with him. To this Inglesant consented, visits being a rare pleasure to him, and they rode together to the gentleman's house, which stood on the edge of the downs, with a courtyard and gatehouse before it, and at the back a fair hall and parlour, having a wide prospect over the valley in the distant view. Johnny was courteously received by the popish lady and her sister, who was devout and very pretty. The supper would have been very plain, the day being a fast, but the gentleman insisted on waiting while a rabbit was cooked for his friend, and when it came he partook of it himself, in spite of his wife's remonstrances, out of courtesy to his guest, he said, and also to enable him to get over his next fine, which, he said, it ought to do. The ladies asked John Inglesant many questions about the father and what took place at the priory, also about his brother, the page. This made him leave early, for though he knew nothing of any plots or treason, he was constantly afraid of saying something he ought not to do. Nothing was said, however, about the morning mass, which was too serious a matter to be lightly spoken of. As he rode away through the soft evening light, he thought so much of the story the gentleman had told him, that he made up his mind to ride to the village and see the clergyman whose goodness was so manifest and so rewarded. He surely, if no one else could, would show him the true path of devotion. 2 or 3 days afterward he took the ride, and arrived at the small old church at a very opportune moment, for the clergyman in his surplice was just going in to read the evening prayers. Inglesant attended devoutly, being the only person present, for the sexton's wife, who rang the bell, did not consider that her duty extended farther. Prayers being over, the parson invited Johnny to supper, a much better one than he had than at the Papist's, and Inglesant stated his difficulties to him, and asked his advice. The parson showed him several small books which he had written, one on bowing and taking off the hat at the name of Jesus, another on the cross and baptism and kneeling at the communion, a third on turning to the east, which last appeared to be mostly quotations and enlargements from Dr. Donne, a fourth on the use of the surplice. He repudiated being popishly inclined, having disproved, he said, that any of these practices were popish in all his books, all of which, as far as Johnny could see, displayed considerable ingenuity. And while he inserted many trivial and weak passages, he seemed to have been well read in the Fathers and other old authors, and to have been a loyal, honest, and zealous advocate, according to his capacity, of the Church of England. He evidently looked on forms and ceremonies with the greatest reverence, and was totally incapable of telling his visitor anything of that mystical life he was so anxious to realize. Johnny inquired about the angel, but his host, while not appearing displeased at the reports being spread abroad, professed to deny all knowledge of it, but in such a way as to make Inglesant think he would like to have acknowledged it, had he dared. He rode away disappointed, and began to think he must consult Father St. Clare, which for some reason or other he had felt a disinclination to do. While he was in this perplexity, he bethought himself of his first schoolmaster, the man who taught in the church where Camden visited him. He had forgotten all about this man, except that he was of a mild and kind nature, but he was so anxious for direction that he went to him at once. This man had been very poor, and brought up a large family, all of whom, however, he had put forward in life, some at the university and the church, and some among the clothiers and glove-makers at Malmesbury and the other towns of Wiltshire. Johnny found him living alone, for his wife was dead, in a small cottage no better than a countryman's, with a few books, which was his garden, were all the wealth he possessed. He was a great herbalist, and famous in the country for his cures and for his sermons, though no two people could agree why they admired the latter, all uniting in considering him a simple and rather poor preacher. This Inglesant learnt from a countryman, who walked at his horse's side as he came near the village. But when he found the old gentleman sitting on a bench before his study window, and he rose and met his look, Inglesant saw at once, thanks to the cultivation of his perception by the Jesuit's teaching, what it was that gained him the people's love. He had large and melting eyes that looked straight into the hearts of those who met him, as though eager to help them and do them good. He received Johnny with great kindness, though he had quite forgotten him, and did not even remember when he told him who he was. But when Inglesant, who found it very easy to speak to him of what had brought him there, told him of his difficulties, he listened with the greatest interest and sympathy. When he had finished speaking, he remained some minutes silent, looking across the garden where the hot midday air was playing above the flowers. "You have been speaking," he said at length, "of very high and wonderful things, into which it would seem even the angels dare not look. For we are, as would appear, taught in Scripture that it is in man's history that they see the workings of divine glory. And indeed, worthy Mr. Inglesant, when you have lived to the limit of my many years, you will not stumble at this, nor think this life a low and poor place in which to seek the divine Master walking to and fro. These high matters of which you speak, and this heavenly life, is not to be disbelieved, only it seems to me, more and more, that the soul or spirits of every man in passing through life among familiar things is among supernatural things always, and many things seem to me miraculous which men think nothing of, such as memory, by which we live again in place and time, and of which, if I remember rightly, for I am a very poor scholar, you doubtless know St. Augustine says many pertinent things, and the love of one another, by which we are led out of ourselves, and made to act against our own nature by that of another, or rather by a higher nature than that of any of us, and 1,000 fancies and feelings which have no adequate cause among outward things. Here in this book which I was reading when you so kindly came to see me are withered flowers, which I have gathered in my rambles, and keep as friends and companions of pleasant places, streams, and meadows, and of some who have been with me, and now are not. There is one, this single yellow flower. It is a tormentilla, which is good against the plague. What is it that, as I hold it, makes me think of it as I do? Faded flowers have something to me miraculous and supernatural about them, though, in fact, it is nothing wonderful that the texture of a flower being dried survives. It is not in the flower, but in our immortal spirit, that the miracle is. All these delightful thoughts that come into my mind when I look at this flower, thoughts and fancies and memories, what are they but the result of the alchemy of the immortal spirit, which takes all the pleasant fragile things of life and transmutes them into immortality in our own nature? And if the poor spirit and intellect of man can do this, how much more may the supreme creative intellect mold and form all things, and bring the presence of the supernatural face to face with us in our daily walk? Earth becomes to us, if we thus think, nothing but the garden of the Lord, and every fellow being we meet and see in it, a beautiful and invited guest. And, as I think I remember, many of the heathen poets, after their manner, have said very fine things about this, that we should rise cheerfully from this life, as a grateful guest rises from an abundant feast. And though doubtless they were very dark and mistaken, yet I confess they always seemed to me to have something of a close and entire fellowship with the wants of men, which I think the Saviour would have approved. If you, sir, can receive this mystery and go through the honorable path of life which lies before you, looking upon yourself as an immortal spirit walking among supernatural things, for the natural things of this life would be nothing were they not moved and animated by the efficacy of that which is above nature, I think you may find this doctrine a light which will guide your feet in dark places. And it would seem, unless I am mistaken, that this habit of mind is very likely to lead to the blessedness of the beatific vision of God, on the quest of which you have happily entered so young. For surely it should lead to that state to which this vision is promised, the state of those who are pure in heart. For if it be true that the reason we see not God is the grossness of this tabernacle wherein the soul is encased, then the more and the oftener we recognize the supernatural in our ordinary life, and not only expect and find it in these rare and short moments of devotion and prayer, the more surely the rays of the divine light will shine through the dark glass of this outward form of life, and the more our own spirit will be enlightened and purified by it, until we come to that likeness to the divine nature and that purity of heart to which a share of the beatific vision is promised, and which, as some teach, can be attained by being abstract from the body and the bodily life. As we see every day that the supernatural in some men gives a particular brightness of air to the countenance, and makes the face to shine with an inimitable lustre, and if it be true that in the life to come we shall have to see through a body and a glass, however transparent, we may well practice our eyes by making this life spiritual, as we shall have also to strive to do in that to which we go. My predecessor in this living, doubtless a very worthy man, for I knew him not, has left it recorded on his tombstone, as I will show you if you will come into the church, that he was full of cares and full of years, of neither weary, but full of hope and of heaven. I should desire that it may be faithfully recorded of me that I was the same. John went with him into the church and read the old vicar's epitaph and several more, for he was very much taken with the old gentleman's talk, and indeed stayed with him the whole day, his host adding a dish of eggs and a glass of small beer to his daily, very frugal meal. Johnny invited him to come to the priory, and so left him, more pleased and satisfied with this than with any of his other visits. As he rode back through the darkening valley and through the oak wood before the priory gate, he little thought that not only should he not see the old parson again, but that his quiet, contemplative life was come to an end, and his speculations would now be chased away by the life of action. And for the future, the decision, often to be made at once as to what he ought to do, would appear of more consequence than that other decision which had seemed to him sometimes the only important one as to what it was right to think. When he reached the priory, he found the Jesuit had returned, and when at supper he inquired of Johnny if his ride had been a pleasant one, as the servant had told him he had been out since the morning, Johnny began at once and told him all that had been passing in his mind since the priest had given him the book, and of all the directors he had sought for his guidance. Father St. Clare listened, though it may be doubted whether the recital was altogether agreeable to him, with great attention, and seemed pleased and amused at the boy's descriptions, which showed his pupil's fine perception of character. "You have taken a wise course," he said, "which has led you to see much of the workings of the minds of men. This is the most useful study you can follow, and the most harmless to yourself, if you keep your own counsel and gain knowledge without imparting it. I am glad you have told me all this, because it shows me I have not been deceived in you, but that the time is fully ripe for you to play the part your father and I have destined for you, and to play it, to great extent, alone. The day after tomorrow we shall go up to London. On the way I will open to you the position of parties, the crisis of affairs, a position and a crisis such as never was before in this or any other country. You are very young, but you are years older in mind than most of your age, and your youth renders you all the more fit for the work I have for you to do. I trust you without reserve. I shall commit to your keeping secrets, which would, if revealed, bring the highest heads in England, not to speak of my own, to the block. I have no fear of you." Inglesant listened breathlessly and with open eyes to this address. It made his heart beat high with delight and excitement. Death, nay, the bitterest torture, would be nothing to him, if only he could win with this man's approval, and be not only true but successful in his trust. His entire devotion to the Jesuit cannot be looked upon as anything wonderful, for the whole mental power of the latter, directed by the nicest art, a power as an art at the time not surpassed in Europe, had been directed to this end upon the boy's susceptible nature, and the result could not be doubtful. The Jesuit might well say that the crisis was imminent, and the position of affairs peculiar. Plotters were at work in all directions, and for different ends, but the schemes of all miscarried, and the expectations of all proved to be miscalculations, those of the Roman Catholics, with whom St. Clare was associated, more than all. Their expectations were at the highest pitch. The court influence was with them to a large extent. The Church of England was at its highest summit of glory and power, and its standing point was almost their own. Laud was partly gained. He had refused a cardinal's hat, but in such a way that the offer was immediately renewed and remained open. It seemed indeed as though little more remained to do when this goodly edifice began to crumble slowly, indeed, but surely, and with accelerating speed. A new power appeared in the country, hostile indeed to Catholicism, but what was much worse, also slightly contemptuous of it, directing its full force against the Church and the Crown. The Church collapsed with wonderful suddenness, and the Crown was compelled to seek its own preservation, extending what little aid it might be able to render to the Church. Neither had the least power or time to give to the assistance of their former allies. All this had not happened when the Jesuit and Johnny rode up to London, but it was foreshadowed clearly in the immediate future. End of section 6.